Okay, so I am delighted to welcome you to our final installment of NCFS in Captivity, which has been a monthly pandemic book series where we've discussed, as you know, recent books in 19th century French studies. And as many of you know, the idea for the series started as a way to compensate for the postponement of our beloved conference, NCFS. And here we are, 11 installments later. So I want to thank my co-organizers, Masha Belenky and Susan McCready, without whom all of these wouldn't have been possible. And we are also just so grateful for all of you who have participated. So many of you as authors, as interlocutors, all of you for coming and joining yet another Zoom month after month, asking such engaging questions and sticking around to chat. It has truly made all the difference during this pandemic year. So as you know, the NCFS conference is back in the fall, knock on wood, and in DC. Hope to see all of you there in the flesh. But the book series, we hope, is also here to stay. So please continue to email us at ncfsbookseries@gmail.com. So I'm delighted to introduce today's author, Peter Brooks, as I remember vividly reading some of his works when I was a graduate student, particularly reading for the plot. I have a kind of visceral memory of this and how it just fundamentally transformed the way that I thought about books and just opened things up for me in a new way. So it's really my absolute pleasure to close out this series introducing his latest. So Peter Brooks is Sterling Professor Emeritus of Comparative Literature at Yale University. He has also taught at Princeton and the University of Virginia. He has published on narrative, psychoanalysis, law, largely in 19th and 20th century literature. And in addition, he's the author of 2 novels, Worlds Elsewhere and The Emperor's Body. His critical books include The Melodramatic Imagination, Reading for the Plot, Troubling Confessions, Realist Vision, Henry James Goes to Paris, Flaubert and the Ruins of Paris, and most recently, Balzac's Lives. In conversation with Peter today is Susanna Lee, Professor of French and Francophone Studies, who also directs the program in Global and Comparative Literature at Georgetown. Her research focuses on 19th century narrative, intellectual history, and comparative literature. Her third book, Detectives in the Shadows, A Hard-Boiled History, was published with Johns Hopkins in August 2020. And she's also the author of Hard-Boiled Crime Fiction and the Decline of Moral Authority, and A World Abandoned by God, Narrative and Secularism. And she edited the Norton critical editions of Proust's Swann's Way and Stendhal's The Red and the Black. So I will now turn the conversation over to them.
Hey, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for a discussion of Peter Brooks's Balzac's Lives. And let's let him kick it off. So Peter, I'm very glad to be here with you, my former advisor. There you are. So why this book? Why Balzac? And can you say a bit about how you put it together as you did?
Thanks, Susanna. Let me just start by thanking Masha and Susan and Rachel, and especially Susanna, for this session. Balzac, I've wanted to write a book about Balzac for about 30 years, I think. I've done short pieces on him. I've edited a book of his short stories. I've taught him over and over, but how to write a book about him? I mean, the human comedy is so vast, as you all know, over 90 novels and tales. How do you get a grasp on it and make sense of it, especially for an American public? I mean, the French continue to read Balzac all the time. He's available in paperback. He's taught in schools. He's on the programme for the various concours and so on. But he lost steam in America some time ago. There are not that many of his works that are available now in good modern translations. And he seems to have no presence in contemporary American culture, which he certainly did have if you go back to around 1900, when there were a couple of different complete human comedies in English translations. It's too bad because it seems to me he speaks so much to contemporary obsessions. He's really at the origin of contemporary obsessions. So how to make people aware of what Balzac is all about? Well, the obvious solution was to write a biography, but there are already good biographies of Balzac, and even one of them in English. And anyway, biographies never seemed to me a way to get at what's most interesting in literary works and their authors. Biographies tend to scant the work in favor of the life. Explanation of the creative process, it seems to me, often moves from sublime results to trivial causes. In fact, I detest most literary biography, which seems to me a way to tame and make anodyne what's most remarkable and challenging in art. So then the idea came to me, why not write biographies, not of the writer, but of his characters, of the fictional lives he created? There are over 2,400 fictional persons in the human comedy. I think that even beats Shakespeare. But what would be the point of this enterprise? Well, it's that these invented people and their origins and their careers, their ambitions and their loves, their successes and failures, especially in the way they interact, represent a vast panorama of life as it was lived at a moment of rapid social transformation in the wake of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic epic. Balzac gives us the dynamics of society in early capitalist development the way no one else does, where old systems of social cohesion have been lost, where everything seems to be up for grabs, where individual ambition can lead to fortune, but at the same time lays bare the kind of shredding of the social fabric. Balzac's ambitious young men, and there's some women too, remain extraordinarily close to us because they continue to ask, who are we, individually and collectively? How do you know who people are, what to expect for them, how to evaluate them in this new social order where everyone wears black, where clear signs of social distinction that you had in the old regime, at least in a nostalgic view of the old regime, have vanished. There are vertiginous new freedoms, opportunities for self-definition and self-fashioning for the self-made man, but in Balzac's view, at tremendous cost. Individualism reigns and it's exciting, but the result is a very unstable social order. So I think the great question in Balzac's world becomes, who are you? What can I know about you? Can I trust you? And he, of course, found a way to address these questions through his creation of retour des personnages, the returning characters from novel to novel, which helps him people his world, recalling stories of other lives of other novels, not in any systematic way. As he says, life is a mosaic. We may see someone first in middle age, then to get the story of his youth later. We encounter a staid, respectable husband, and later learn of his tempestuous and tragic first love, and so on. And with these returning characters, Balzac's world becomes crowded in a very interesting way. You enter a salon and you start to rub elbows against old acquaintances. More and more, you don't need the outside world. Reality within this world is complete. For instance, just an obvious example, a real poet such as Alphonse de Lamartine, who's present in a lot of early Balzac novels, disappears. His place is progressively taken over by the fictional poet Melchior de Canalis, who can do all that Lamartine did, but more. As Oscar Wilde said, the only real people are the people who never existed. One of his profoundly true epigrams. It's the victory of the imagined and dramatized world over the real world, and it's a lot more fun than the real world. But of course, I could only do a selection. I chose 9 characters that I thought were broadly representative, and these, of course, pulled in others as friends and lovers, antagonists and co-workers and so on. And I tell their lives as they come to us in the novels, trying to suggest how reading a single novel creates the appetite for more, continuing the exploration of the lives we've glimpsed. So I think that's actually a primary experience in reading Balzac, the need for more. And he creates a new form of reading that we now call binging, right? That we know mainly through the TV serials. And that's a form that Balzac would have loved, I'm sure. The closest contemporary analog to the human comedy, I think, is something like Game of Thrones. But Balzac's serial doesn't take place in some invented mythic past, but here and now in modern French society, which is, of course, mainly French society of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But I think it's also extraordinarily close to ours. I mean, his diagnosis of society and where it's headed, I think, has been largely confirmed over the last couple of centuries. He declared himself, and I think it was a bit theatrical, a conservative Catholic and monarchist. But as you know, he's always been appreciated most of all by the Marxists, starting with Marx and Engels themselves, because his critique of modern society from the right aligns him most with those on the left who want to change the world utterly. He condemns unbridled ambition and the cash nexus that's become the sole measure of success and power, replacing the old regime valuation of landholding. Yet he's fascinated by what he condemns. He's in fact full of sympathy for these restless souls, young men and women who are seeking something new, who want to conquer the world, not only for its riches, but also in search of new experience, to see where their demonic energy will lead them. In art and invention, in love and sex as well, Balzac takes us to the further shores of experience and experiment. So, just to conclude, I think he was extraordinarily bold in seeking truth in extreme forms of human experience. He loved to explode lies and hypocrisy, which makes him perhaps bracingly relevant to our present moment. Well, I'm going to stop there. And Susanna, I know that you are armed with all sorts of barbed questions.
Okay, hope you're ready. No, thank you very much. That was great. And it's interesting when you talked about, going into a salon and rubbing elbows with old acquaintances. It reminds me that, as we get older, the fictional characters are some of the people that we've known the longest, so our relationship with literature, you talked about wanting to write a book on Balzac for the last 30 years, and those relationships with fictional characters are, as Oscar Wilde said, there's something very real about them. And I guess one question I'll kick off with is, this is so for those who don't have, if there's anyone here who doesn't have the book, I'll just say quickly that the characters that the 9 chapters cover, it starts with Rastignac and then goes to Gobseck, then Antoinette de Langeais, Raphaël de Valentin, Lucien Chardon de Rubempré, Jacques Collin, Elias, etc. Henriette de Morsauf, le Colonel Chabert, and Marco Facino Cane and Friend. Were there any characters that you were going to write a chapter on, but then decided, no, I'm going to put this other person instead? Or that you had a chapter on and then the editor said, no, the book has to be shorter or something?
No, my editor made me shorten the book. We didn't make me cut out any characters. It was really hard to decide, of course, but I wanted people who had extensive careers. I mean, some of them were obvious, like Rastignac, who keeps coming back and ends up extraordinarily, a prime minister in France with apparently no qualifications except ambition. Or Henri de Marsay, same. His only experience seems to be in seducing and deceiving women, but that makes him into a great statesman by the end of his career. And there were other people I really sacrificed with regret, such as Laurence de Saint-Cygne in Une ténébreuse affaire, but there just isn't enough of her. She really just exists within the boundaries of one novel. So I wanted those people to keep reappearing. And as I said, some of them were obvious. Gobseck also as the usurer, who's kind of the still center of the turning earth, because everyone comes to him. All the dramas of Paris come to him in search of money. I certainly wanted to do some of Balzac's women characters because they, in many ways, were what appealed to his audience the most. I mean, people like Henriette de Langeais or Henriette de Morceau for Antoinette de Langeais got a terrific reader response. There are not that many letters from Balzac's readers to the author, the way there are with Eugène Sue, for instance, but they're enough to show that he really struck a chord. And it's what drove his principal critic, Sainte-Beuve, crazy. He said that Balzac conquered his audience, a woman audience, like the plague through their infirmities, because he revealed their infirmities. They did crazy stuff.
Okay, and another thing you said during your talk was Balzac being at the origin of contemporary obsessions. And so one question I'd like to ask is, off of that, what are the contemporary obsessions? That's one question. And the related one is, if Balzac were in the present, how would Balzac write the present era? And assuming that immortality were possible, it's a big if, but it's a big what if, but what character would be the primary in that enterprise, do you think?
Well, I mean, I was very struck, of course, by when Thomas Piketty's The Economist book came out on capital in the 21st century. And it turns out that he illustrates his arguments about wealth so much through Balzac, right? Through particularly Rastignac and Vautrin, their conversations about getting ahead. And it seems to me that, as Piketty sees, that hasn't changed in the last 2 centuries that much. I mean, getting ahead is still a problem. The advantage of inherited wealth, or as we might put it in our society, the kind of privilege that comes with certain backgrounds has become more marked rather than less. And so that whole problem of a world of social stratification, which is obviously more marked and more evident in Balzac's time, but continues to be an enormous problem today, and very much at the heart of our contemporary debates about American society. It's all there in Balzac, right? And even though he presents as a political reactionary, he understands very well from the point of view of the have-nots what the issue is. And Vautrin becomes, in fact, the spokesperson for that in his conversations with Rastignac. And then later on, when he changes sides and passes from the criminal world to the police, he says to Granville, the procureur, you know, what I've done is just what Nucingen, the banker, did legally. And I just did it from the convict side, but there's absolutely no difference. And in fact, Nucingen is more profoundly immoral. He's caused more unhappiness in his financial shenanigans than I have. So, I mean, that's just the beginning of an answer to your question, which is, about his immortality if he came back. Well, certainly he could have revived Lucien de Rubempré, right? In the midst of fake news. And I mean, you only have to add what he says about newspapers, the internet and Facebook and Twitter, and you've got it, right? It's all there.
Yes, your chapter on Lucien de Rubempré is quite enlightening, about quite resonant when you think about the state of journalism today. Who, when you were writing this, who's your sort of ideal audience? Is it somebody who knows Balzac's entire oeuvre and can say yes, yes, yes to each one of these descriptions? Or is it somebody who has an American who has never heard of Balzac? Or is it somebody who maybe read Père Goriot in school? Or who are you writing for?
Certainly not to such an expert audience as this one in 19th century French studies. You all know Balzac as well as I do. I was trying to write, yes, I think your last example, someone who's heard of Balzac, maybe read one novel in high school or college, probably Le Père Goriot, since it's the most read currently, and had some sense that Balzac was an important figure in world literature, but hadn't found a way to get into him yet. I mean, I hope it's the kind of threshold book to usher people into the Comedy Humaine.
Okay, sounds good. What else? Well, one question, and Jen Advisor has posted a question in the chat that she wrote, how much of this project is related to rereading? Could you have written this book without having reread these novels many times? And the question one of the questions I was going to ask you was, this is a magisterial, 30,000 feet up book about a magisterial author. So I wondered if you could say something about your research methods for this book in particular.
Well, you're absolutely right. Janice, right. It involved a great deal of rereading, and I reread certain things over the years, but I wanted to extend myself to have read more or less everything that fits in the Comedy Humaine. And I discovered things that I really didn't know very well. I mean, Une ténébreuse affaire, I think the first time I read that book, I was so confused about the plot, which is absolutely baroque, that I never realized what a magnificent novel it is. The person who crowned it a masterpiece actually was Paul Valéry, the poet, who hated novels, but he's absolutely right, it's a masterpiece. And others such as Le Cabinet des Antiques. And I wanted to teach that at some point, but there's absolutely no contemporary translation available. Last one was done in 1901. Scandalous. So anyway, yeah, a lot of rereading, catching up with Balzac criticism, of which there's been a lot, particularly in France, and also the recent work on fictional characters, some of it coming out of cognitive neuroscience and what's called the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis, that novels are useful to us because they enable us to read other people. And I think that's a very interesting point. I think we knew it already, right? I mean, I think the stuff from cognitive neuroscience is simply confirming what every serious reader of a novel already knew, that, and as you mentioned in the beginning, those fictional characters whom we've internalized are part of our social compass of how we get along with other people and understand them and figure out whether we can trust them and so on.
Okay, another question in the chat is from Maria Scott. I'd be interested to hear about the problem of trust, and I wrote that down too. How what do I know about you and how can I trust you? And they wrote, were the 1830s a time of particular complexity in terms of navigating the social world?
Well, I think, the kind of emblem of that comes along early in my work on Balzac is Vautrin, right? Who is living in this pension, this rather greasy pension, along with a penniless student and various other people like Goriot who are on the decline. And he turns out to be a convict in disguise, and he'll be exposed, and the TF branded on his shoulder will be exposed when Mademoiselle Michonneau's whacks him on the shoulder, and then the police cart him off, and of course he'll be back. But I think it is a kind of initial emblem of how you can't trust appearances. And of course, so many of the novels are about learning to read appearances or read through appearances, you might say, to what lies behind. And I think the social instability of the period has a great deal to do with that. I mean, look, you're just coming out of the Revolution, Napoleon, then the Restoration, and then the Revolution of 1830. And most of Balzac's novels are written post-1830, but the vast majority of them about the Restoration. So he's looking back on a period which came to a bad end, right? Which crashed. And there's a lot in Balzac about why it didn't succeed. So there's this sense of everything being up for grabs, and the fact that he opposed that, of course, made him a better analyst of it than he might have been otherwise.
Great. Another question, a specific question about Le Chef-d'œuvre inconnu, and the role of art. What reading suggestions you would have on Le Chef-d'œuvre inconnu and the role of art in Balzac's work, especially the role of painting?
I don't actually talk much about Le Chef-d'œuvre inconnu, partly because it's been so much talked about. But I am interested in all those Balzac creators, inventors, searchers for the absolute. I mean, literally in the case of La Recherche de l'Absolu, Balthazar Claes, who thinks he can find the absolute, or the writer figures. I mean, the narrator of Facino Cane, and I do talk about that tale, thinks he can pass over into the souls of other people and espouse their perspectives on life. And he compares that to a dervish in the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, who can enter and possess the soul of another person. And I think that's part of the same quest for this kind of realm of absolute expression, which you get in Le Chef-d'œuvre inconnu, and which meets with failure, of course. And the failure, I think, in that book and in so many others, is on the plane of expression. I mean, I think that it's possible that Freinhofer actually sees his vision of the absolute, but he can't put it into language. Remember, he ruins his canvas by overpainting it, and there's just this one perfect foot sticking out at the corner. And Claes dies raising himself on his deathbed to shout "Eureka" as if he'd finally. So I think there, or Louis Lambert may be the best example, the philosopher who's about to get married, remember, to Pauline de Villenoix, and tries to castrate himself on the eve of his marriage, and then becomes catatonic. And he has, he's still having visions of some world of truth that Pauline, who takes care of him, tries to translate for the narrator. You remember, he lets slip sort of Vatic phrases like "les anges sont blancs," that sort of thing. No one else can interpret it but Pauline. So yes, I mean, I think this quest for kind of absolute art is very important, and I think Balzac himself was worried about going mad for having created so much, or he was worried that he was transgressing on the creative role of God the Father. I mean, there really is kind of some deep obsession with transgression in Balzac, and it's sexual, but it's also creative.
Huh. Okay.
Okay.
I'd like to ask more about that, but I'm.
Well, you can. I can talk.
I need to sort of think about what you just said in order to ask the question. So while I'm doing that, Melanie Hawthorne has asked about the Lanty family and their shady past, saying they aren't as well known as Rastignac, etc. and company, but do you think they resonate with modern readers?
Yes, there's all that discussion at the beginning of Sarrazin about the origins of the Lanty fortune. And of course, the origins turned out to be rather special in that case. So the castrato Zambinella and her remarkable career, but it's everywhere in Balzac. When Lucien, you remember, Lucien is courting a daughter of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, Clotilde de Grandlieu, and people start saying, but what does he live on? What's the origin of his fortune? And the notion is that he has to buy back the alienated Rubempré lands of his mother's family in order to assure himself social standing with the Grandlieu. But the way he's going to do that is through Vautrin Collin's sale of his mistress Esther to Nucingen. So what's supposed to be social respectability is going to depend on the most sordid of acts, right? I think that question of where does money come from? You know, the old phrase that pecunia non olet, money doesn't smell. Yeah, but you're always sniffing at it in Balzac's world to try and figure out how it smells.
Well, before going to the next one, I am interested in what you said about the concern or apprehension in Balzac about transgressing and taking over the role of, creating too much. Can you say a bit more about that? Where you see that, how that comes out for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you see it, for instance, in some of the short fiction almost best, in something like Adieu, where you have this woman, Stéphanie, who's become aphasic through the trauma at the crossing of the Berezina River and the retreat of the French armies from Moscow. And her ex-lover, Philippe, discovers her and tries to cure her by all sorts of means, including at the end, recreating the scene of the trauma and creating a false Berezina on an estate in Saint-Germain, then bringing her to it. And he succeeds in that her mind seems to become active again. And she says, Philippe, je t'aime, adieu, and then she dies. So, I mean, it's manipulating life a little bit too much. It's trying to become the creator of another life, and Philippe succeeds momentarily, but then he kills his subject. Or something like, I mean, in the erotic realm, something like Une Passion dans le désert, the story of the French soldier who falls in love with a panther. An incredible story, right? And it enables, in my mind, Balzac to talk about sexuality, and particularly female sexuality, in a way that he couldn't do in a sort of more direct discourse. But that ends badly too. And he thinks the panther is out to bite him, and he stabs her, and then immediately feels enormous regret. And you get something like that played out, perhaps on a bigger scale in La Cousine Bette, late in his career, where you have all these sort of psychically unleashed erotic characters, starting with Hulot, but also with Maria Marneff and Josepha and so on, and all trying to use their eros to control other people and destroy other people eventually. So that's kind of rambling answer to your question, but some elements of it answer.
Okay, and Raisa Rexer asked how the process of extensive rereading for this book and tracing out of the characters' lives changed your perspectives on the novels or not.
It certainly enabled me to see connections I hadn't seen before, as well as to get into texts that I had sort of neglected before. I mean, things like La Vieille Fille and Le Cabinet des Antiques, and to see just an extraordinary set of, I don't know, it's like electric wires everywhere in Balzac, and you send a current off through this place and it shows up in some very different place, and or something like La Muse du Département, where Lousteau comes back as the seducer of Dina La Baudrée, and it's really Michel Butor talks about that, how if you read the whole of the Comédie Humaine, it becomes totally self-sufficient as a world. You don't need anything else. And that is sort of the experience that I have. You begin to live within its confines, its spacious confines, I should say.
Thank you. And then from Sarah Maza, we have one of the contemporary resonances of Balzac that comes through beyond themes of ambition, money, and media are Balzac's portrayals of non-normative, even downright kinky sexuality. Can you comment more?
Yeah, well, I just mentioned a couple of them. I mean, especially Passion dans le désert, very kinky, or something like La Fille aux yeux d'or, which ends with this strange discovery between Henri de Marsay and La Marquise de Saint-Réal that they're half brother and half sister, both the children of Lord Dudley. And at that point, instead of lamenting what they've done and so on, de Marsay tries to kiss her, and there's a kind of incipient moment of incest there. And then she says, no, brother, I love you, but I'm going off to a convent because having lost this woman, Mariquita, what was it, Paquita, I have lost the infinite, so nothing on earth will satisfy me anymore. But yeah, I mean, Balzac was very much interested in same-sex relationships and kinky relationships. Proust picks this out, that Balzac was really the first major writer to talk about same-sex relationships, and it's quite widespread actually in the Committee of Men.
Okay, and then from Jennifer Yee, we have, if we read Balzac too closely through a sociological lens, is there a danger that we won't do justice to him as a visionnaire?
I think that's true. I mean, French historians still go back to Balzac as the best data for his period, but you always have to keep in mind Baudelaire's comment that he passes for a great observer, but he's really a great visionnaire. And I think, in some sense, the best book on Balzac, or at least let's say the best short book on Balzac ever written, is Albert Béguin's Balzac Visionnaire, which came out right after the Second World War and sort of recalibrated all of that. Yeah, I think that you have to read Balzac in an understanding of the social world is of enormous importance, but it's also kind of a facade for what goes on behind the social world. And that's, the oeuvre philosophique are supposed to open up that world, something like La Peau de Chagrin as a parabolic instance of what the other novels are about, or then the Études analytiques, which on the whole never got written, but in their fragmentary state are quite interesting. We're supposed to give us the principles of the philosophical understanding of the world.
Okay. And somebody else's, Vesna Elez has said, novels versus novellas. Are Balzac's novellas the quintessence of his novelistic art?
Well,
La Fille aux yeux d'or, etc.
I see the motive of that question in that he's often more formally experimental in the novellas, and lots of them are kind of oral simulations, something like Autre Étude de Femme, where you have a whole bunch of people gathered late at night in Félicité Détouche's salon, and they each tell stories, and the reactions to the story are as important as the telling of the story. So there's that kind of back and forth, the conversational ricochet that you get more in the novellas, I think. And I think in also in some of his subject matter, I mean, Une passion dans le désert, Adieu, those are novellas, and La Fille aux yeux d'or also. I think he feels less, how should I put it, less responsible to do the sort of social thing in those novellas, and can open himself up more. Facino Cane is another wonderful example.
And here's one from Maurice Samuels. Can you say more about recent approaches to character, like Blakey Vermeulen? Does Balzac offer a unique perspective on the study of character?
Yeah, Maurice, as I was trying to say earlier, that work, including Blakey Vermeulen's book, Why Do We Care About Fictional Characters, was important to me as I was writing this. I was not always convinced by it, but it was reinforcement for my idea that it's worth paying new attention to fictional characters who were, in formalist criticism, were very much out for a long time. And if you go back to structuralism and for instance, Roland Barthes, character is just a kind of intersection of semiotic codes that gets a proper name. And there's all this stuff about the personnage Balzacien being this overstuffed Victorian creation that we're not interested in anymore. But that was wrong. And I think even Barthes demonstrates in Essed that the character is much more interesting than he ostensibly thinks it is. Yeah, I think the passage through all that study of codes in structuralism, and also in sociologists like Irving Goffman, have led us back to a new ways of reading characters. I mean, we are all coded in many ways, and certainly reading social novels, we're always decoding. I mean, the favorite example of everybody in English literature now ad nauseam is Jane Austen, but it's certainly true that Jane Austen novels are all about reading other people and are reading the reading of other people. And Balzac gives us that too, and he's very self-conscious about reading with someone like Rastignac or Lucien when they first come to Paris and have to learn the codes. But what's different, I think, in Balzac is that there's always a great deal riding on these readings socio-historically, right? I mean, they're always very much living in history in a way that we don't so much feel in Jane Austen, for instance.
Okay, and speaking of characters, especially overstuffed ones, Bill Paulson has written, if you chose rightly for your project an audience very central characters, but if you had chosen more eccentric or quirky ones, some of which you've mentioned here, would your collective portrait of Balzac have been different? Or do you think you would have arrived at the same place, albeit by a less obvious route?
I do try in my final chapter to pick up some of the more kinky person, but yeah, I do. I mean, I feel I've done injustice to some of them. And next book, I mean, I mentioned Laurence de Saint-Cygne. There's also Victorien d'Esgrignon, who is that's a wonderful novel, Le Captivity des Antiques, much neglected, comes to a very satisfactory climax when Diane de Maufrigneuse comes and tells all the aristocrats, she being the chief among them, that they're living in the 17th century and they got to get with it, right? And Victorien has to marry a rich bourgeoise, or there's no other out for him. So yeah, no, there are a lot more to talk about.
And Christine Tomte has asked about Balzac's exposing lies, hypocrisy, which makes him relevant to our present. And she asks, taking into account the notion of tempérament and the theory of passions, how would you relate the idea of hypocrisy to the bad faith of Rastignac and that of l'Abbé Birotteau from Le Curé de Tours?
Hypocrisy and bad faith, and what else? That was a complicated question.
Yes, I realize. Taking into account the notion of tempérament and the theory of passions, how would you relate this idea of hypocrisy to, say, Rastignac's bad faith or l'Abbé Birotteau from the Curé de Tours' bad faith?
Well, I think, bad faith, Rastignac's bad faith is assumed with a good deal of lucidity, right? I mean, he rejects Vautrin's plot for him marrying Victorine Taillefer and chooses Delphine de Nucingen instead, and that allows him to escape an obvious murder plot, but it involves him in all sorts of other shenanigans. And we never really know how much of this is bad faith and how much of it is hypocrisy in his. I mean, how much he really believes in what he's doing and how much he doesn't. I mean, the novel, the short novel, the novella again, that's supposed to explain all that is La Maison Nucingen, but of course it doesn't. I mean, we learn in it how he made his fortune by serving as a straw man for Nucingen's, that is his mistress's husband's, financial plots and really outrageous frauds. But it's implied that he doesn't really know what he's doing. I mean, Rastignac is sort of the original Teflon person, right? He's in the mud up to his neck, but it all falls away from him. Whereas you take someone like Lucien, when Vautrin tells him that he's got to sell Esther, his mistress, to Nucingen, what do you have? You have one imploring glance from Lucien, and then he falls into line. So it seems to me that's a much greater case of corruption.
Okay. There's a few more questions in the chat, but I want to make sure I get to this. There was one thing I wanted to ask you, and I think it may interest others too. Can you say a bit, you've published a lot of works of criticism, you've published 2 novels, and can you say something about the experience of writing and publishing for a popular audience versus a scholarly audience?
Well, I think the great problem we all have at the moment is one of audience. I mean, we can write and write, but who's going to read us? And it's something that's been worrying me a lot. And I know in particular that not many people read literary criticism anymore. When I was at college, people actually would buy and talk about works of literary criticism as if they mattered. That doesn't happen anymore. And so I've tried sort of starting with the Henry James Goes to Paris book, and then in the Flaubert book to construct a narrative on which I could hang literary criticism. It was interesting, the Flaubert book, my editor there at Basic Books kept saying there's still too much literary criticism in this. No one's going to like that, So how do you present things to a popular audience? Is there a popular audience? I mean, I don't know in the Balzac book, it's particularly during the pandemic, it's been very hard to know what the echoes are from anything that you publish. But I think, I feel a little bit like Stendhal in saying this, that every time you set out to write something, you have to think about inventing your audience. And I'm not saying that like Stendhal, I'm taking a lottery ticket to say I'll be read in 100 years. I'm not that vain, but you really have to sort of, it's really a bottle thrown into the sea with a message in it at the moment, much more so than in the past.
It is. Maybe MC Hammer will discover your book.
I'm sorry?
I said maybe MC Hammer will discover your book. He's a rap singer who has discovered a fondness for French literary criticism and who posts about it. Here's a question about the cover of your book. Why did you choose Rodin's Balzac as the cover, or did you choose it, or
that was actually the editorial department at NYRB. It's not. I mean, I would not have thought of using the Rodin statue, which I thought was too grandiose for the book, but it's Edward Steichen's photograph of the Rodin statue, which comes out to be sort of wonderfully melodramatic and grandiose. So I said, why not? I mean, the editor's original idea was to have an artist draw a portrait of Balzac surrounded by his characters, but that never got anywhere. I sort of liked that idea, but it never took flight.
Surrounded by these 9 characters, or surrounded by?
No, surrounded by these 9 characters.
Okay. Couple of more questions. Can you say a bit more about Balzac's take on lesbianism, and if you think it still has purchase today? Do you think his view on female same-sex relations, is his view on female same-sex relations informed by others of his time or of earlier times?
I think there was a lot of interest in it at Balzac's times, and there was. I was just reading a manuscript of a book by Anne Linton. It's coming out soon on hermaphrodism at this time. I think it's just I think it's much less gender specific society than our own. There's much more fluidity, and certainly in the sort of bohemian circles in which Balzac lived, he was very much interested in same-sex relations. And there was, the point when he was living with Georges Sand's former boyfriend, and Jules Sandeau. And a lot of people at the time assumed that they were lovers. There had never been any proof one way or another. That doesn't really answer the lesbianism question, except that I think that he tolerates a much wider gamut of sexual preferences than a lot of later writers do.
Or maybe embraces it, since, you know, if you're going to transgress and create more than others, then, you know,
that's right.
It's going to be wide.
And if you do have this capacity to put yourself in the place of others, including women, I mean, the strange text, the Mémoires de Jeunes Mariés, which is his one full-length epistolary novel, these two young women who've been at the same convent school together and come out in society, they talk about all sorts of things that you wouldn't have sort of thought that Balzac thought about, like birth control, for one thing, you know, and how many children should you have if you want to keep the family fortunes together, and so on. Yeah, quite remarkable.
Okay, and the last question we have on the chat is, how do you approach the not great Balzac, the really vite fait Balzac? Une fille d'Ève comes to mind, for example, from Masha Belenky.
The what Balzac? I know.
A not like a Balzac that's not really great, like a Balzac that's kind of just vite fait.
Oh,
how do you approach that?
Like in Une fille d'Ève? Well, Une fille d'Ève, come on, it's quite interesting, particularly if you've read L'Ulysse dans la Vallée, because here you have Félix de Vandenesse, who's married this young Angélique de Granville, who immediately starts drifting towards an affair with Raoul Nathan. And we know Nathan from several places, including Illusion perdue, where he's, to Lucien, he's a great author, though he's become sort of a minor vaudevilliste later in life. So there's, it is one of those novels where your extension into the other novels that feed into it gives a lot more heft to it. I grant you, it's not one of the greatest, but it's not without interest, I think.
Okay.
And he manages to keep his wife from adultery. There you go.
There is always that.
Okay.
We're approaching the hour, and as a way to sort of, you know, wrap up the discussion and sort of segue into the more informal time, I'll ask you a question that probably shouldn't be asked at 2:59 of a Zoom presentation that ends at 3, but can you say you've had a long career, you know, you've been teaching for decades, you've been writing for decades. Can you say, and there's people on this call who are, you know, full professors, associate, assistant, grad students, and or maybe others who are other things that I don't know about. Can you say something about what comments do you have about the state of the field, and what would you say to younger scholars coming up today?
Wow.
I know.
I mean, the career obviously has become so much more difficult it was than I entered it, and the demands are so much greater. What impresses, I mean, I get very depressed about the future of our profession at times, and I was talking to my another old student, D.A. Miller, the other day, who said the profession is finished, but that's not the impression I have. I mean, there still continue to be extraordinary students, graduate students in French, for instance. And I don't know where they come from and why they still keep coming, given the obstacles that lie ahead of them, but they do, and they're as good as ever. So I have some hope that, I don't know, as we emerge from the pandemic. I was just talking this morning at an MLA conference about this Teagle Foundation initiative for great books, courses, and so on. Some hope that the humanities are going to reinsert themselves as the absolute key moment in everyone's education and what we all need to get through pandemics and to get through life and death and everything else. So, I think we have to keep militating. And I know it's not easy, and many of us are very overworked. And as I said, it's very hard to find an audience for what we do. But there are still people interested,
Okay, at this time, I'm going to ask everybody in the audience to turn on your cameras. And thank you, Peter, very, very much. And let's give Peter a round of applause, and then we can talk freely.
Thank you.
More freely.
Thank you all.